So, welcome everyone to the program. My name is Mdu In, and today I am once again very happy, very thrilled to welcome back Richard Peirce. For those of you who didn't watch the previous interview, let me just remind you who Richard Peirce is. So, Richard Peirce is best known as a shark conservationist. His main focus over 20 years. So he's been the chairman of the Shark Conservation Society and the Shark Trust, which was established in 1997 and operates from Plymouth, which is in the UK. Richard has authored several books on the topic of sharks and shark conservation. Richard and his wife, Jacqui, are confirmed nomads who spend half of the year in South Africa. Their love of wildlife takes them to the bush at every opportunity. However, in recent times, Richard has focused his attention on another wild animal that is in danger from human interference, the pangolin. His latest book, Scales of Injustice, focuses on the mystique and the danger which surrounds the pangolin. So let me just tell you a little bit about that book. So it says, the most trafficked wild mammal in the world. So scream the headlines. The burgeoning international trade in these mammals means all 8 of the world's pangolin species, 4 are African, 4 are Asian species, are under threat of extinction. However, the global COVID-19 pandemic has now shown a new light on the trade. Pangolins have been named as possible vectors for the coronavirus to travel from their bat hosts into humans. In Southeast Asian wet markets, multiple wild animals are indiscriminately stacked in small cages, one on top of the other, their bodily fluids mingling unchecked. This providing just the required pathways for transmission of the disease. In Pangolins Scales of Injustice, Richard Peirce introduces readers to this enigmatic and discreetly charming mammal. He pieces together the likely history of a pangolin poached in Zimbabwe and brought to Johannesburg to be traded. Readers accompany an agent of African Pangolin Working Group on a real-life sting operation to rescue the animal captured by the traffickers, and follow the subsequent rehabilitation and release of the animal into the wild. Peirce unpacks the methods and terrifying statistics of the trade, describes visiting markets and restaurants in Southeast Asia, explains the links between wildlife and COVID-19, and details China's response to the unfolding drama of the pandemic. Wow. That was a mouthful. Richard, welcome once again. Thank you for speaking to me once again.
Thank you.
You know, as I was reading this particular book, so I've read some of your other books as well. This particular book, there were moments where I was almost in tears, and there were moments where I was happy. Because number one, you've managed to write a story about the pangolin, which is a very mysterious animal. Personally, I've never seen a pangolin. Many people have never seen a pangolin, but the way you've written the story has made us feel like we know this animal, and it's attached emotions to an animal that usually people would not think is emotional. So why did you write this book about the pangolin now?
Because it's the most trafficked mammal on the planet. And my job really, I see my job as bringing to public attention the plight of certain species of animals, and trying through my books or films, whatever it is, to help them by increasing public awareness, and where necessary, maybe trying to move governments towards legislation. And when you've got the title that you're the most trafficked mammal on the planet, that's a pretty horrific title. And I think as soon as I heard that, and I can't remember where, it was something like weird. I was driving somewhere or just reading something very casually, and I just saw those words, most trafficked mammal on the planet. I thought, wow, no question about the book I'm doing next. It has to be about pangolins.
Yes. Wow, I didn't realize that. And when I was reading the book, I thought it was interesting that most people have never seen a pangolin yet. It's the most trafficked mammal in the world. That was interesting to me. However, in the foreword of the book, there's a man called Isaac Kreiper,
Yeah,
and he is a Komani San Bushman elder.
yeah,
And so he wrote or he spoke the foreword to the
yeah.
book. How did you connect with him, and why was it important to get him to give the foreword?
Well, I was very interested in the pangolin's place in sort of African, and particularly Southern African, South African culture. And I go to the Kalahari a lot. And if you want to know about animals living in the Kalahari, and the Temminck's ground pangolin is one of the species of animals living in the Kalahari, then who better to speak to than Bushman? And he was an extraordinary guy. And, you know, these people are wonderful storytellers. You need a lot of time if you're going to listen to them. And give them the slightest encouragement, and they just go on and on and on with these fantastic stories. And I was listening to him even through a translator. I was mesmerized by what he was saying, and what came across to me was his passion for wild animals. And I don't think it was for my benefit. His passion for the pangolin, he really meant what he was saying. He really felt they were fabulous little animals. And you know, when he said things like, this species walks with the wind. You know, I felt almost goose pimples coming up. You know, I mean, it was really, really strange. And then another thing, he was talking about the pangolin song, and how when the moon is in a certain phase, when you just got that little slither of moon, you know, if you imagine that little slither being tilted a little bit, it could be like a bucket. And so they wait, the Bushmen, until the moon is in that phase during the rainy season. And then they sing the pangolin song, and they burn tortoise scales and pangolin scales on a fire, blood and smoke and God knows what goes up into the sky. They sing the pangolin song, and then it rains. Now, the creepiest thing about this was, about a week after he told me this story, I was still in the Kalahari, and you can guess what I'm going to say. We were looking out one night, and there's the moon on its side, this little slither, and guess what happened the next day? I don't know if anybody was singing the pangolin song, but it was
It rained.
fantastic, and he was fantastic. And the other thing interesting about him is that he was telling me that possibly, I can't remember now actually, but a few years back he started getting requests from people to catch pangolins for them and supply pangolins, and he always said no. And one of the reasons he always said no, apart from the fact he didn't want to hurt a species they regard as their friend, is that if you kill a pangolin, you're cursed. You get bad luck. And so the last thing he would want to do is to invite problems like that. But he was a fabulous guy, and I wanted a kind of indigenous view on pangolins, which is why I went to him.
Yes. Wow. So it sounds very mystical and very spiritual.
Yeah.
So then, please tell us about the first time you actually met a pangolin. You actually encountered a pangolin. How was that experience like when you actually saw it up close?
But you've just used the words, really. I mean, I was really excited because everybody I'd spoken to kept on talking about this enigmatic, charismatic, mystical animal that has this kind of funny power, you know, magical power. And they always talk about the eyes. And there's a film called The Eye of the Pangolin. One of the first women I interviewed was a woman from Zimbabwe who rescues pangolin. And she said that the reason she got involved in pangolins was that the first time she saw one, the eye drew her in. It looked at her, into her, through her, and around her. So I met my first pangolin probably with too much expectation. And I was in the veterinary wildlife hospital in Johannesburg, and they had a few rescued animals there. We were lucky enough to go walking with one of them that night. And when they took one of them out of the box where it had spent all day and took it over to the scales to weigh it, it wasn't frightened. It didn't curl up. Its head was up. Its eyes were looking, and I made very sure I looked at its eyes. And it was a weird thing because I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe a flash of light, maybe God to come down or something or other. But I just looked at it and I saw an eye. And then you look again, and then you look again. And that eye is just extraordinary. It's everything. It's sad, it's wise, it does look in you, through you, at you, and it's quite difficult to describe. And that's what happened in about 2 or 3 minutes
Yes.
of watching this animal being weighed and carried around.
So that pangolin that you're referring to is the pangolin called Zambezi, who's
That
the main character of the story.
that actually wasn't Zambezi. That was another rescued pangolin.
Ah,
But it was in exactly the same place that Zambezi was
yes.
rescued in, rehabilitated in, and exactly what I saw that night is exactly what happened to Zambezi.
Mm.
He was put back together again there, and then he was taken out on these walks, and then slowly rebuilt and rehabilitated till he was fit enough to be released. So exactly what I saw was what happened to Zambezi. Yeah.
Wow. You know, Richard, you managed to humanize. You managed to add a human element to this story, even when you described one of the poachers. And that was very interesting to me. So there's a man called Joseph Kumalo from Matabele land in Zimbabwe. So he was one of the poachers, and he was brought in, but he was in the lower end of the poaching hierarchy. And he was brought in by a middleman called David Masonda, so who's also in the story. Now, the story of Joseph is a very sad one because he comes from a poor background, and so because he needed money and his family was very desperate for money, and so that's how he got into the trade. Why did you choose to humanize him or to express him in a compassionate way, Joseph?
Well, because there are two victims here of scales of injustice. One of them is the pangolin. But in a way, I wanted people to understand that at the bottom ground level, the poacher, who is only trying to feed his family, he's only trying to afford medicine for a sick son. If he's offered a chance to make money, and the average amount that rural Africans live on across the continent is less than $2 a day. Now, for those of us lucky enough to have enough money, it's really difficult to understand that level of poverty. And if someone comes to you and offers you an opportunity, you've got to be a very strong, very exception. I don't know. So I regarded Joseph as much of a victim, really, as Zambezi, because he was just trying to survive. That's all he was trying to do. And one of my big things is that, you can't blame people at that level. You can blame the crooks and the people making huge profits and the traffickers, but the poor guy at the bottom trying to get food for his family, to me, that's not a crime. He's just surviving. And I hope I put that across.
Yes, you did. Yes, I felt compassion for Joseph. And I wondered what happened to him afterwards, because they were arrested. What happened to him?
All three of them went to jail.
Is he still in jail now? Do you know?
Let me think about that. I think he's probably gone back to Zimbabwe. Whether he's went back to serve some jail time or whether he was just repatriated, I'm not sure. But I think he's back in Zimbabwe now. If he went to jail, he would be due for release pretty soon. But I hope he's back with his family.
Yes, I hope so too. Yeah, that was very touching for me because I could relate to people's desperation because they need to survive. And I think sometimes a lot of people don't have that compassion. When we think about poachers, we just think about these evil people and we don't realize that there actually is a human element behind it. It doesn't justify poaching, but it in a way, it explains why some people get involved. And then, yes.
Yeah. And then, I mean, let me give you a crazy example about poaching and this sort of thing. Well, I was doing a rhino book years ago, and someone said to me, he said, look, you imagine in Europe, cows walking around with a lump of gold stuck on the front of their head. How long would those cows be walking around before someone killed them and took the lump of gold off? That is what a rhino is. It's effectively an animal walking around with a lump of gold stuck on the front of its head. That's what a pangolin is. They're creepy, they're there, they're covered in a gold skin, if you don't want to look at it that way. Their scales, which are worth so much money. And if you're a poor rural living person, it's survival that counts. You don't have the luxury of how you survive. You just have to survive.
What do they use the scales for? Or do they eat pangolin meat? Because on page, yes?
Yeah, sorry, no, yeah, no, go on with your question, because I think you're going to get there.
Yes. So on page 27 to page 28, you mention China and Vietnam as particularly big markets for illegal wildlife trade, especially the pangolin. Firstly, how do you know that China and Vietnam are the biggest markets? And then what do they use the pangolin for?
Okay. I know this because of statistics. You know, we know where pangolins are going. They're coming out of Africa, going off to the Far East, because the four Far Eastern species are now hugely diminished. So the focus for pangolin, you know, in terms of acquiring them, has come to Africa. So they go from Africa off to the Far East. So that's the statistic we know. I know more than that, in the sense that I went to Vietnam and Laos to look at the other end of the trail, and it's quite terrifying. I mean, this is illegal. These countries have signed up and agreed that this is illegal to trade in this species. And yet I wandered around in Vietnam and Laos and very easily, came across pangolin products being sold. Now, if I can find them and I'm just a tourist, then the police can certainly find them. And I walked into one restaurant, for example, within 15, 20 minutes, I was being offered pangolin meat at $300 a kilo. And then when I started to bargain, I think the guy thought that I was, you know, very interested or something. So he then offered me the whole animal. And so I bargained a bit more, and he started off at $4,000, and then he came down to $3,000. And because I still didn't say yes immediately, he obviously thought that, you know, he had to give a little bit more. So then he said he would offer me a private dining room where I could bring my friends and so on and so forth. He went up and showed me this private dining room. And then he said, and if I wanted to be sure that I was getting what I was paying for, he more or less said, we'll bring it live to the table and kill it on the table for you. So this is supposed to be an illegal trade, for God's sake. And yet, there am I, you know, a foreign European tourist, walk off the street and I'm offered this. And nobody was making any attempt to enforce the law they've signed up to.
So how do they get away with this? So if it is illegal, and in South Africa also, it's illegal. So how do they get away with it when they do it so blatantly?
Well, things have changed since I started writing the book. What has come along is coronavirus. And Vietnam in particular have put in effective wildlife laws now, and it looks as if they're policing them, which they were not doing before, which is great news. Unfortunately, China doesn't seem to have gone to the same extent as Vietnam, but we're all sitting and watching. So how do they get away with it? Well, I can only assume that the authorities were not interested enough to police it. Or maybe, one hates to use words like this, maybe there's corruption among the police or something. Because, look, as I said, if I can walk around in Laos and Vietnam and find tiger products, pangolin products, lots of illegal things, rhino products, then if I can do it, the police can easily do it. So they have to know it's going on a big scale.
Wow. So I want to, in the book, you also talk about a man called Ray Jansen. So Ray Jansen and his passion for saving pangolins, and he was part of the sting operation that arrested David Masondo and Joseph Khumalo and another man also who was involved. How do you connect with Ray Jansen and his sting operation?
Well, when I started doing the research, I came across the African Pangolin Working Group, and Ray is one of the founders and the chairman of that. And there's another woman called Nikki Wright, who's also one of the founders, who's involved in the rehabilitation in the Johannesburg Wildlife Veterinary Hospital. So I connected with Ray, and it was a great meeting because pretty soon I discovered he wasn't just someone who talked a lot. He does talk a lot, actually, but he was someone who actually does it as well. He was the guy who goes on the sting operations. So he connects with the police, he puts the operations together. He and the police work really closely together to set it up. And then he actually gets the pangolin and hands them back to Nikki and the vets to be rehabilitated and put back to the wild. So, you know, a very extraordinary man. And he's putting himself at risk. And he was just a great character because, if you're a storyteller, and that's really all I am, you need good characters to tell stories about. And this wasn't a James Bond kind of guy. He didn't sort of come in looking all exciting and spy-like and tough and special forces. He looks like a professor, which is what he is. So that made him even more interesting. Here is this bearded professor sitting there with a 9mm pistol, risking his life for wild animals. It was a great story. I had to tell it.
Well, yes, I have to say I enjoyed reading about him, and I enjoyed the sting operation. On page 54, you detail the sting operation. So Ray was involved, and the police also were involved. But one thing that caught my attention as you were describing the sting operation are the emotions of the pangolin. You detailed how horrific the situation must have been for the pangolin, that was Zambezi, that was being trafficked. Do you know if pangolins have emotions and can be traumatized by an experience like that? That was a horrific experience that he went through.
They can certainly be traumatized. I mean, I'm absolutely not an expert, but talking to someone like Nikki, who is the person who rehabilitates them along with Dr. Karen at that particular place, and other people, part of rehabilitation is getting them back from the trauma they've experienced. So they are frightened, they are hungry, they are disorientated. So whether you call that emotions or whether it's just, other dimensions, I don't know. But they're deeply affected by what happens to them, which is why they need rehabilitation. And what I did is I kind of worked backwards from what people like Nikki and Ray told me, in what condition the pangolins were in when they were rescued. And I thought, well, what has happened to them kind of mentally and what have you, and in terms of feelings and fear to get to that stage of trauma and of stress. So that's how I kind of tried to work that out.
Yes, I mean, on page 63, you actually say pangolins are highly sentient and sensitive beings. So, like most mammals, they are conscious of what is happening around them and who you are, and they can maybe sense your energy. So now, Richard, I want to talk about COVID-19 because I think a lot of people will be interested in the connection between COVID-19 and the pangolin. So in chapter 11, you begin detailing the coronavirus, and you make distinctions between the COVID-19 is one of 7 coronaviruses. So namely, there's SARS-CoV, there's ERS-CoV, there's HKUI, there's NL63, there's OC43, there's 229E. So those are just some of the coronaviruses that you mentioned. And you mentioned that the Chinese wet markets and the mixture between other wild animals such as bats and pangolins, and how they slaughter these animals is maybe how the coronavirus or the COVID-19 began. Can you unpack this for us and make us understand what do you mean by this?
Okay. Corona just means crown. That's what the word means, crown. Flu and colds are coronaviruses. This is just the latest one. What is so worrying about this one is its transmissibility. It goes from human to human really fast and really easily. And it's not as deadly, for example, as the first SARS. SARS stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, which means difficulty in breathing, which means pneumonia. The first SARS was in 2002, I think, or maybe 2002, let's say. And that was more deadly. That killed about 10% of people who got infected. This current coronavirus, COVID-19, and that just stands for coronavirus, COVID, COVID-19, the year it appeared. The current coronavirus is not as deadly as that SARS, for example. So these coronaviruses start in, let's say, a reservoir, a receptor, which is bats. And a lot of research has been shown that bats are full of various types of coronaviruses. Not a problem. They live in bats and that's fine. They can stay in bats. It only becomes a problem if they jump from one species to in this case, humans. And that is what's happened in this case. Now, how do they get from bats to humans? It is suspected that they have to go through what's called a vector, which is kind of the intermediate agent. The first SARS one, for example, 2002, the big suspicion there is it came from bats to civet cats. And the anomaly there is that civet cats are not actually cats. So let's just call them civets. It went from bats to civets that were killed in these food markets, live food markets in China, and from civets to humans. But here we are, 2021, so what are we? We are 20 years later nearly, and science still has not 100% agreed that civets were the vector. Right, then we come to pangolins. One of the big things for me with this book was February 2020, when I was up in the Kalahari doing the research, and I was there the day the news broke that scientists had discovered a very, very convincing, compelling match between coronavirus in pangolins and in humans. And so then they started to suppose that the vector might well be pangolins, Malayan pangolins. It's still not 100% accepted by science, but most of the scientists I've spoken to are pretty convinced that's what's happened. Whether it will ever be 100% convinced, whether the case will ever be made 100%, we don't know. I suspect not. Only last week or the week before, the World Health Organization had a delegation that went into Wuhan in China to investigate the origins. I'm no scientist at all, but logic would dictate or would indicate to me that this was mission impossible, because they're not going to find evidence more than a year later. And I'm not sure the Chinese were very cooperative anyway in helping them look for the evidence. There were lots of things that they weren't allowed to see, weren't allowed to do, information that was withheld. So what they managed to rule out was that it was not a laboratory construct. They seemed to all agree that it was not something constructed in the laboratory. One of the crazy theories was the Chinese had constructed this specially to destabilize the West and weaken Western economies. No, apparently not. All quite convinced that's not the case. There's still a very strong case for the fact that it originated in the wet markets. And I think most of us are pretty convinced that Malayan pangolins were probably the agent. And don't forget, with a virus this transmissible, it only takes one human to be infected, and then 2 humans, 3 humans, 4 humans, 5 humans, and it spreads literally like wildfire, which is what happened.
Wow, that's scary. Especially now, it's very scary.
What's really, really scary is that there's almost certainly going to be other ones, and it's going to get worse. Researchers went in China to an area where there are loads of caves full of thousands of bats. And they did research among these bats. And there's not just 6 or 7 coronaviruses, there are hundreds of them. And if we continue consuming wildlife and getting closer to wildlife than we've ever been before, because we're crowded on this planet now, so we're coming in more contact with wildlife, then this is not going to be number 6 or 7. And that's going to be the end of it. This is probably just one of, there's loads of them were waiting to come down the track, I'm afraid. Let's just hope we learn enough from this one to stop a repeat being as bad. But I'm not convinced.
Yes. Wow, well, that's scary, especially now that there's this new variant that seems to be deadlier than the previous one. That for me is very worrying, and the fact that this new variant affects even younger people, not just older people, but it kills even younger people. You know, Richard, at the beginning of our interview, we mentioned Isaac Kruiper, the Komani San Bushman elder, and he says that whoever kills a pangolin will be cursed.
Yeah.
Do you think this is a curse? That we are not, that actually those words are actually coming true?
I'm supposed to be a sophisticated Westerner and who's not believing in this kind of thing. But if you ask the same question to Isaac, what I can tell you, because I asked him the question, he wasn't remotely surprised by a coronavirus coming from pangolin. The whole idea to him was perfectly feasible, because if you're going to abuse a species like this, if you're going to turn this little innocent, fabulous animal into the most trafficked mammal in the world, Isak's view would be you're going to pay a price. And so he wouldn't be. Isak would almost subscribe to the view that this would be the revenge of the pangolin. You know, actually, it's not a bad view to subscribe to, whether it's true or not, because it might stop us doing what we're doing. And that's the important thing.
Yes. You know, there's a saying that says the chickens will always come home to roost.
Yes.
And perhaps the chickens are coming home to roost. And it's a wake-up call for us to think better and how we treat other sentient beings around us with the power that we have as human beings, how to use that power productively in a way that doesn't hurt and enslave other mammals around us.
I mean, I think that you use the word enslave. That's a very accurate word, because why do we as humans assume that all the other species are there for our use and pleasure or whatever, to be effectively enslaved, serving human interests? That can't be fair in anybody's book. But we're still doing it. We're still doing it. It's enslavement and exploitation. And they're both wrong. All species have a right to live undisturbed on this planet together with the rest of us. That's my simple view.
Richard, thank you.
Not at all. It's been great to talk to you again. I don't know if I've mentioned to you, but we have, I hope, an influential film coming out soon about the lion bone trade.
Yes.
So, you know, maybe when that film comes out, we can chat again. It's always a real pleasure to talk to you.
Yes, I look forward to speaking about that documentary, especially after our conversation about the book that is related to that documentary, Cuddle Me, Kill Me. So we'll speak. Yes, so we'll speak again after the documentary has been released. So for now, Richard, thank you. So Scales of Injustice by Richard Peirce. Thank you.
Thank you very much.